David Williams had always believed that a man's worth was determined by his actions and his character, not by how much money he had in his bank account or the brands he wore. His story began like any other ordinary day. A bright morning, crisp air flowing through the open window as he sat behind the wheel of his average sedan, headed to a local luxury car dealership in the heart of the city. He had worked tirelessly for years, first building a reputation in finance, then securing a steady stream of high-paying clients. Now, he was ready to reward himself with something that symbolized his success, a luxury car. But it wasn't just any luxury car, it was the one car he had dreamed about for years. He had researched it endlessly, from its design to its performance, and it stood as the pinnacle of what he had always wanted to achieve. That morning, David felt a mixture of excitement and pride. As he parked in the dealership's lot, the towering glass walls and polished floors reflected the image of the upscale cars parked inside. It felt like entering another world, a world he had only ever seen in magazines or the glimmering advertisements online. The cars, with their sleek curves and expensive appeal, almost seemed to exude an air of exclusivity, a world that, for a moment, David wasn't entirely sure he belonged to. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his shoes clicking against the marble floor as he stepped into the showroom. The salesperson at the front desk gave him a brief glance before turning back to the computer screen. David wasn't sure if it was his appearance, the fact that he didn't wear the sharpest suit, or simply the color of his skin, but the receptionist didn't greet him with the warm welcome he expected. After a moment of silence, the receptionist finally stood up and, in a curt tone, asked if he needed assistance. David nodded, introducing himself and expressing his interest in a particular car model that had been the object of his desire for years. "Ah, yes. That model," the receptionist said, barely looking at David as she shuffled through papers on her desk. She seemed distracted, uninterested, as if she didn't believe David was a serious buyer. "It's quite expensive, you know. Would you like to take a look at some of our other options?" she suggested, almost as if trying to direct him towards something more affordable. David, taken aback by the dismissal, tried to ignore the tone. He had dealt with subtle prejudices before, whether it was in his career or social settings, but this was the first time he had encountered it so openly in a place that was supposed to represent sophistication and success. He had dealt with people doubting him his entire life, people who underestimated his abilities because of his background or his appearance, but this felt different. It stung more than usual. "No, thank you. I'm here for the X900. "I've done my research," David replied, attempting to remain calm despite the sudden shift in energy. The receptionist hesitated, clearly annoyed, and after a brief pause, she signaled to a sales representative across the showroom. A tall man with slicked back hair and an air of superiority walked toward David. His expression was polite, but there was a coldness in his eyes, as if he had already judged David and found him unworthy of his time. "Can I help you?" the man asked with a rehearsed smile. His tone was polite, but there was no warmth, no eagerness to assist. "I'm interested in the X900, David repeated, trying to be clear and assertive. "I've done all the research, and I'm ready to make a purchase today." He knew his words carried weight. This was no longer a dream, it was about to become a reality. The sales representative's eyebrows furrowed, and for a split second, there was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He glanced at David, his gaze lingering just a bit longer than necessary, before turning away and waving his hand dismissively. "Let's take a look at some of the models over here," he said, leading David away from the X900 and toward a lower-end car that clearly didn't match the grandeur of the model David had his heart set on. "You might find something you like here. It's a bit more practical." David's chest tightened. He could feel the judgment seeping through the air, like an invisible barrier separating him from the world he had just stepped into. The dealership, with all its gleaming cars and luxurious interiors, wasn't a space meant for someone like him. At least, that was what they wanted him to believe. "Actually, I'm here for the X900, David repeated, his voice now firm, even though a knot was beginning to form in his stomach. He wasn't used to being treated this way. He had worked his entire life for moments like this, and yet here he was, being subtly pushed aside as if his presence didn't matter. The salesperson gave him a tight-lipped smile, and his voice grew more insistent. "Sir, the X900 is a premium model. Perhaps you should consider a financing plan, or maybe we could show you something that's within your budget." David paused, feeling the sting of the insinuation. He was used to hearing those kinds of assumptions, but they still cut deep. "I can afford the X900, I don't need financing," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but it was hard. His words felt heavy, laden with the weight of being doubted. The salesman's smile faltered for a moment before he gave a dismissive wave toward another section of the showroom. "If you want, I'll have someone bring it up for you," he said, turning his back without waiting for an answer. David stood there for a moment, seething with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He watched as the sales representative walked away, as if David didn't matter. As if his worth was reduced to the suit he wore, the car he could afford, and the color of his skin. He felt the sting of their rejection, an emotional punch that felt like a cold slap across the face. This wasn't just about a car, this was about something deeper. About respect. About being seen as more than just a stereotype. His mind raced. Could it really be happening again? He had faced discrimination before in subtle forms, in backhanded comments and unspoken judgments, but this felt different. He felt small. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that they thought he couldn't afford the car or the way they made him feel invisible, like he didn't belong. David turned to leave, but not before muttering a few words to himself. Words that were as much a promise as they were a vow. "I'll be back. And you'll see. You'll all see." He walked out of the dealership, his heart heavy but his mind set. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. He wasn't going to let them define him, not now, not ever. He had been knocked down before in his life, and he had always risen. This would be no different. As the door closed behind him, he took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing with resolve. The dream was still alive, but the fight for it had just begun. David knew that he would return, this time, on his terms. And when he did, things would be different. David Williams had always believed that success was earned, that the true measure of a man lay not in his possessions but in the journey he took to acquire them. For most of his life, he'd been a man who relied on his hard work, discipline, and unwavering belief in himself. Born in a small, middle-class neighborhood, David had watched his parents struggle to make ends meet. His father worked 2 jobs, his mother worked long hours at a local diner, and while they never had much, they instilled in him a sense of determination that would shape his future. Growing up, David learned the value of persistence and dedication, lessons he carried with him into adulthood. His childhood had been far from glamorous, and that was precisely what motivated him to reach for more. He wasn't interested in handouts, and he didn't believe in shortcuts. Everything David had achieved was a direct result of his own efforts, from his academic success to his career. He had worked tirelessly to earn his degree in finance, fought through long hours in entry-level jobs, and slowly built his way up to a position where he could finally call the shots. Now, at 32, David had achieved financial stability and was considered a rising star in the world of finance. His clients trusted him with their wealth, and he had earned the respect of his colleagues. It was with this sense of accomplishment and the belief that he had finally arrived that David drove to the luxury car dealership that fateful morning. He had been dreaming about the car for years, the X900. Sleek, fast, and a symbol of the success he had worked so hard for, the X900 represented everything David had strived to become. It wasn't just a car to him, it was a reward for all the sacrifices he'd made along the way. And today, David was going to buy it. No more dreaming. No more wondering if he could afford it. He was going to walk into that dealership and drive out with the car he had always wanted. When he first pulled into the dealership's lot, David felt the sense of awe he'd always imagined when entering such a space. The showroom, with its gleaming marble floors, polished chrome, and pristine cars, felt like a temple dedicated to wealth and success. He could see it all, people in sharp suits, their eyes gleaming with the same sense of self-assurance that he now carried. The cars in the showroom stood as markers of personal achievement, each one more refined than the last. David took a deep breath as he parked his car, letting the excitement wash over him. He was here, in the land of the elite, and he was ready to claim his place. As he walked through the glass doors, he couldn't help but notice how everything felt perfectly curated. The scent of leather, the soft hum of classical music playing in the background, and the impeccably dressed staff all gave the impression that this was a world in which few were welcome and even fewer could afford to truly belong. David's suit was sharp, but it wasn't the same tailored fit of the other patrons he saw milling about. He felt his own insecurity tugging at him as he walked toward the counter. He wasn't sure whether it was his own perception or the way the employees looked at him, but the glances he received made him feel like an outsider. He brushed it off, telling himself that his success wasn't about fitting into their world, it was about owning it. The receptionist barely looked up when he approached the counter. There was no smile, no enthusiasm, just a cold, businesslike attitude. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sharp as she continued to type away on her computer. "Yes," David said, his voice confident. "I'm here for the X900. The receptionist's fingers froze above the keyboard for a moment, and she looked at him up and down with barely concealed skepticism. She didn't seem impressed by his presence, and her demeanor made it clear that she wasn't expecting him to be a serious buyer. "Right. Well," she said, still not meeting his gaze, "I can have someone show you the other models. Maybe you'd prefer something more practical." David's brow furrowed slightly. He had expected this dealership to be exclusive, but he hadn't anticipated the blatant disregard. He knew it wasn't the car he wanted to see, they were clearly trying to steer him away. The tone of her voice was dismissive, and he could feel the weight of her judgment, though she had yet to directly say anything offensive. Her lack of interest stung. "I'm here for the X900, he said again, a bit firmer now. "I've done my research. I know exactly what I want." The receptionist sighed and waved toward a sales representative across the showroom. As he approached, David immediately noticed the way the salesman's eyes scanned him, from head to toe. He wore a suit that was clearly more expensive than David's, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor as he walked over with the arrogance of someone who had been groomed for this kind of environment. "Can I help you, sir?" The salesman's voice was cordial, but there was an underlying edge to it, as though David wasn't quite worthy of his attention. David nodded, undeterred. "I'm interested in the X900. I've done all the research. I'm ready to make a purchase today." The salesman's eyebrows shot up for a fraction of a second before his smile returned, forced and tight. "Ah, yes, the X900. A fine choice. But you might want to consider financing options for such a large purchase. Have you considered your options?" David's chest tightened slightly, but he kept his cool. It was obvious that they had already judged him, by his appearance, his background, and the color of his skin. He didn't need to be told how to finance a car. He was ready to pay in full, but he wasn't sure if the salesman even believed it. "I don't need financing," David said, his voice calm but steady. "I'm prepared to pay in cash today. I know exactly what I'm getting." The salesman looked at him in disbelief for a moment, but quickly masked it with a strained smile. "Well, perhaps you'd like to look at a few other options," he suggested again, this time leading David away from the X900 and toward a few less expensive models. David's heart sank. He could feel the subtle but unmistakable discrimination, the assumption that because of the way he looked or what he wore, he couldn't possibly afford the car of his dreams. This was a moment of truth for David. He had dealt with prejudice before in small, unseen ways, Perhaps it was the snide remarks of a colleague, the raised eyebrows when he entered an upscale event, or the skepticism of strangers. But this was different. This was blatant. He refused to be cowed. "I came here for the X900. I don't need to look at other models," he replied firmly. The salesman's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I'll see if we can get the car out for you," he said, his tone still patronizing. "But you might want to reconsider. The X900 is a premium vehicle, after all." David could see through the thinly veiled disrespect. They weren't just questioning his ability to afford the car, they were dismissing him as unworthy of it, as if his presence was an intrusion. He could feel the anger rising in him, but he kept his voice steady. "No, thank you," David said, his decision made in that instant. "I'll take my business elsewhere." As he turned to leave, the full weight of the experience hit him. His vision blurred slightly, and his mind raced with frustration. He had worked so hard for this moment, fought through so many challenges, and yet, here he was, treated like an outsider in a world that was supposed to be for people like him. He had always believed that his success spoke for itself, but today he had learned an undeniable lesson. No matter how much you achieve, no matter how hard you work, there are some who will always try to put you in a box, define you by their narrow expectations, and keep you out. But David wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. As he walked out of the dealership, a fire was ignited in him. He promised himself that this wouldn't be the end of his story. He would return. And when he did, they would see him for who he truly was. He wasn't just a man who had worked hard for his success, he was a man. David Williams walked away from the dealership that day with a sense of both fury and determination coursing through his veins. As he made his way to his car, the anger that had bubbled up inside him slowly transformed into something more focused: resolve. He wasn't going to let the arrogant dismissiveness of the dealership define him. He knew he had worked hard for what he had, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially those who had judged him before giving him a chance, take that away. David spent the next few days reflecting on what had happened. The incident had shaken him more than he was willing to admit, and he realized that it wasn't just about the car. It was about something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Growing up, David had faced all kinds of prejudice, subtle and overt, and while he had always found ways to rise above it, this experience felt different. It felt like more than just a challenge to his ambition or his status. It was an affront to everything he stood for, a reminder that no matter how far he had come, the world still saw him through a lens shaped by stereotypes and assumptions. But instead of letting that bitter taste linger in his mouth, David began to channel his frustration into something more productive. He decided that he was going to return to the dealership, not as the man who had walked out in anger, but as someone who was going to prove his worth, not just to the salespeople but to the world. David wasn't going to let them think that they had the power to push him away. He was going to come back and buy that car. But more than that, he was going to show them that he had earned every right to be there, and that he wouldn't be diminished by their narrow views. Who would never let anyone define his worth. Over the next few days, David put his plan into motion. He researched the dealership thoroughly, learning about its history, its reputation, and its key personnel. He reached out to connections in his network who had ties to the luxury car world and began building a strategy to ensure that his next visit would be unlike the first. David knew he needed to approach this with more than just raw emotion. He needed a plan, a way to make his presence undeniable and his purchase irrefutable. His strategy was simple. He would show up at the dealership not only prepared to buy the car, but with an air of confidence and authority that would make it impossible for anyone to deny him the respect he deserved. This time, there would be no doubt. In the meantime, David took his frustrations and transformed them into a powerful sense of purpose. The following week, he walked into the dealership once again. This time, there was no hesitancy in his steps. His posture was straight, his gaze clear, and there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. The receptionist who had dismissed him before barely glanced at him as he walked in, but David made it clear that he wasn't going to let any negative energy affect him. He approached the desk, his voice steady and firm. "I'm here for the X900, he said, his tone brokering no argument. The receptionist looked up at him with a slightly confused expression but quickly regained her composure. "Ah, yes," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "I'll let someone know you're here." David didn't wait for her to make her move. Instead, he crossed the showroom floor, purpose in every step, and made his way to the same sales representative who had tried to steer him away from the X900 the last time. The man was talking to a well-dressed couple when he noticed David approaching. He looked slightly startled, and his polite smile faltered for a moment. "Good afternoon, sir," the salesman said, his tone now noticeably different. "How can I assist you today?" "I'm here to buy the X900, David replied without hesitation, his voice carrying authority. The salesman paused for a moment, clearly unsure how to respond, before trying to mask his discomfort with a smile. "Of course, sir. Let me show you to the car." David followed him through the showroom, this time feeling the eyes of other customers and staff members on him. There were no more dismissive glances, no more subtle judgments. The atmosphere had shifted. As the salesman led him to the X900, David couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. He had returned, and not only had he come back with confidence, but he was also prepared to make the purchase. The luxury vehicle was everything he had imagined and more. Its sleek design, the smooth lines of the body, the powerful engine that hummed with potential, it was the epitome of the success he had worked so hard for. As they stood in front of the car, David could see the sales representative eyeing him differently now, almost as though he was trying to recalibrate his assumptions about David's worth. There was a clear shift in the way the salesman was speaking to him now. The sales pitch was smooth and convincing, but David wasn't fooled. He could see that the man was trying to salvage what little credibility he had left after dismissing him the first time. David didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore, but he couldn't help but notice the palpable change in tone. "I'm ready to purchase," David said calmly, making his decision. "I'll pay in full." The salesman, visibly surprised, took a step back. "Of course, sir. I'll prepare the paperwork right away." The deal was done. There was no negotiation, no question of whether or not David could afford the car. He had made it clear from the start that he wasn't there to haggle, he was there to claim what was rightfully his. The paperwork was completed quickly, and before long, David had the keys to the X900 in his hand. As he left the dealership, driving the car off the lot, David felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the car, it was about something far greater. It was about proving that he was more than what others had assumed. It was about showing the world that no matter how many barriers others tried to put in his way, he would always find a way to rise above. This car wasn't just a status symbol, it was a declaration. It was a symbol of perseverance, of triumph over prejudice, and of the power of self-belief. David didn't stop there, though. The experience had awakened something deeper within him. He realized that while his personal victory was important, it was equally important to use his position and resources to help others who faced similar challenges. He wanted to create a space where people like him, people who had worked hard and fought through obstacles, could thrive. He didn't want to simply be a symbol of individual success, he wanted to be part of a movement that changed the way society viewed people based on their background or appearance. So, David set his sights on something greater than just his own success. He began mentoring others, using his position to help them break through barriers in the same way he had. He spoke out against systemic injustices, against the kind of discrimination he had faced, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that people of all backgrounds had the opportunity to rise to the top. In the end, the car was more than just a material possession. It was a catalyst for a new chapter in David's life, a chapter where he was determined to make a lasting impact. And as he cruised down the open road in the X900, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that the road ahead would be filled with new challenges, but also new triumphs, triumphs that would not only change his life but the lives of many others who saw. David's purchase of the X900 was more than just a personal victory, it had become a symbol of his resilience. But even as he cruised through the streets, proudly sitting behind the wheel of the luxury car, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this triumph was not the end of his journey. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something even bigger. The pride he felt in owning the car was overshadowed by a realization: the battle he had fought was only a small piece of the larger societal puzzle. The prejudice he had encountered at the dealership was not an isolated incident. It was an example of the challenges faced by countless people who worked hard every day only to be judged based on superficial factors like their appearance or background. This understanding deepened over the following weeks as David reflected on his experiences. While he had fought and won this personal battle, he began to feel a responsibility to do more, something that would benefit others who found themselves in similar situations. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became: he had to use his newfound success to effect real change. He had already seen how certain systems favored people based on their privilege, and it was time for him to step up and do something about it. David spent the next few months focusing not only on his work in finance but also on his growing desire to contribute to something bigger. He started mentoring young professionals from underrepresented communities, guiding them on how to navigate the corporate world, offering advice on finance, and helping them secure the resources they needed to succeed. His sessions were informal but impactful, and word spread quickly about his willingness to help those who had been overlooked or dismissed by society. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment in watching his mentor grow, and he realized that his victory at the dealership had opened his eyes to the power he had to make a difference. Yet to find their way. But David's work didn't stop with mentorship. He began using his platform to raise awareness about the systemic issues that often went unnoticed by those who were not directly affected by them. He gave talks at local community centers, sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of breaking down barriers. He partnered with organizations that focused on increasing diversity in the workplace, especially in industries that had long been resistant to change. His voice became a powerful tool in the fight against inequality. As he immersed himself in this new chapter of his life, David also sought to ensure that the X900 wasn't just a personal symbol of success for him, it needed to be a part of something bigger. One evening, as he sat in his garage, looking at the gleaming car, he had an idea that would forever change the course of his journey. He decided to auction off the X900 to raise funds for scholarships aimed at helping young people from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue careers in business and finance. He wanted the car to be more than a trophy, it would be a vessel for change, a tool to empower others. The idea wasn't without its challenges. The luxury car industry, with its exclusivity and high prices, wasn't exactly known for embracing the kind of social good that David was advocating. But David had learned over the years that when you set your mind to something, there's nothing that can stop you. He began contacting high-profile auction houses, explaining his vision, and asking for their support. At first, many of them were skeptical. They couldn't understand why someone would give up a car that had so much personal significance. But David's unwavering passion and the clarity of his message gradually won them over. The auction was set. David's X900 would be sold to the highest bidder, and all of the proceeds would go to the scholarship fund. As the date approached, the story of David's car and the cause behind the auction garnered more and more attention. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the X900 was not just a luxury vehicle, it was a symbol of generosity and change. People who had once dismissed David as a flash-in-the-pan success were now applauding his commitment to creating lasting impact. On the night of the auction, the atmosphere was electric. David stood in the back of the room, watching as the bidding war for his car unfolded. It was incredible to see the kind of attention the X900 was getting, but what excited him the most was seeing the funds pile up for the scholarships. This wasn't about the car anymore, it was about something that would help change lives. The auction exceeded his expectations, with the final bid coming in well above what he had hoped. With the funds raised, David immediately set to work establishing the scholarship program, partnering with various universities and businesses to provide financial aid, mentorship, and internships to young people who needed it the most. The scholarships allowed talented individuals to enter the world of finance and business, people who might otherwise have been excluded due to financial constraints or the barriers they faced because of their backgrounds. David's actions sent shockwaves through the community. The car dealership that had initially dismissed him was soon forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Word spread about the man who had been judged by his appearance and then had used his success to uplift others. A few months after the auction, David received a call from the same dealership. They wanted to apologize for their treatment of him, and they invited him back for a special event they were hosting. David, now in a position where he could not only demand respect but also inspire change, accepted the invitation. He returned to the dealership with a quiet sense of victory, knowing that his actions had transformed not only his life but also the way others perceived success. The dealership, too, had learned a valuable lesson: no matter what someone looked like or where they came from, their worth should never be questioned. The event at the dealership was an emotional one. As David stood before the crowd, he shared his story, of the car that had come to symbolize not just personal achievement, but a movement for greater inclusivity and opportunity. People listened, and many of them, some of whom had once viewed David with skepticism, now stood in awe of what he had accomplished. He spoke not only about the importance of perseverance and resilience but also about the responsibility that came with success, the responsibility to give back, to lift others up, and to challenge the status quo. In the months that followed, David continued his work with the scholarship program, helping dozens of young people enter the world of finance and business. The program grew, and more organizations began to take notice, offering internships, job placements, and other resources to those who had benefited from the scholarships. David had started something far greater than just a car purchase. He had created a ripple effect that would continue for years to come. His story became one of transformation, not just of a man, but of a community, a business culture, and an industry that had long been resistant to change. David's victory over the car dealership was no longer just about proving himself to them. It was about proving to the world that success, no matter who you are or where you come from, should never be limited by someone else's narrow view of what is possible. The X900, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a catalyst for inclusivity, empowerment, and change. David's journey had come full circle, and as he looked back on his story, he realized that the true measure of success wasn't in the car, or the money, or the recognition. It was in the lives he had touched, the barriers he had broken, and the example he had set for others. Success, he knew, was about making a difference, one that would last long after the luxury car was gone. David's life had transformed in ways he never expected, but in many ways, it felt like his journey was just beginning. The auction of his X900 had opened the door to a world of possibilities, and as he spent more time reflecting on his purpose, he began to realize that there was still so much more to be done. The scholarships had changed lives, but David knew that this was only the tip of the iceberg. His mission was no longer about proving his worth to others, it was about changing the way society viewed success and opportunity. The story of David's rise from being dismissed at a luxury car dealership to making a difference in the lives of underprivileged young people had gone viral. His name was on the lips of every major publication, and soon, he became a sought-after speaker. People from all walks of life reached out to him, eager to hear his thoughts on overcoming adversity, building a legacy, and breaking down the barriers that often stand between talented people and their dreams. David, once a man who had struggled to find his place in the world, had now become a symbol of resilience and transformation. As he stood before crowds of people at speaking engagements, he often thought back to that fateful day at the dealership. It had been an ordinary moment, or so it seemed at first. Yet, in hindsight, it had proven to be a turning point. The moment when he was humiliated had been the catalyst for everything that followed. David had always known that he was capable of greatness, but it wasn't until that experience that he truly understood the power of standing up for yourself, of refusing to let others define you. It was that moment of rejection that had propelled him forward, giving him the drive to not only prove himself, but to help others do the same. The scholarship fund he had established grew at an astonishing rate. People saw the value in what he was doing, and many wanted to contribute to a cause that was changing lives. Corporations began to reach out, offering their support in the form of donations, mentorship programs, and internships. The X900, now a symbol of triumph, had far exceeded its original purpose. It wasn't just a luxury car anymore, it had become a beacon of hope for young people who had been told time and time again that they didn't belong in certain spaces. David was creating an environment where they could thrive. Through his involvement with the scholarship program, David began to see firsthand the impact his work was having. He met students who had never dreamed that they could work in finance, technology, or business, fields that had historically been closed off to them. These were young people who had grown up in neighborhoods where the odds were stacked against them, but thanks to David's initiative, they now had the opportunity to break the cycle of poverty and discrimination. He saw the pride in their eyes as they secured internships and job offers, and it was clear to him that he was making a difference in ways he could never have imagined. One of the young men David mentored, Marcus, had always dreamed of becoming a financial analyst. Growing up in a rough part of the city, he had watched as his friends got caught up in crime or struggled with low-wage jobs, never having a chance to reach for something better. When Marcus first applied for the scholarship, he didn't think he stood a chance. He was used to being overlooked, to being judged based on where he came from rather than who he was. But David saw something in him that no one else had: potential. Marcus was one of the first students to receive a scholarship, and David took him under his wing, providing guidance and encouragement. When Marcus secured his first internship at a top investment firm, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. Marcus' success wasn't just his own, it was a reflection of everything that David had worked for. He had made it possible for Marcus and others like him to step into a world that had once felt out of reach. It wasn't just about financial success, it was about showing young people that they were worthy of pursuing their dreams, no matter how big they seemed. But David's success wasn't without its challenges. As his platform grew, he faced increasing scrutiny from people who were skeptical of his motives. There were those who criticized him for being part of the system he had once fought against. They accused him of using his success as a way to further his own agenda, and there were times when the weight of these criticisms felt overwhelming. Yet, David didn't let these voices deter him. He knew that no matter how much he achieved, there would always be people who sought to bring him down. What mattered was the impact he was making, and the difference he was creating for the next generation. David also began to turn his attention to larger systemic issues. As he gained more influence, he realized that true change would require more than just individual action. It would require a shift in the structures that upheld inequality. He used his platform to speak out about issues like wage disparity, lack of access to quality education, and the racial biases that still permeated many industries. His voice became a powerful tool in advocating for social change, and soon, he was invited to speak at high-profile conferences, collaborating with other thought leaders who shared his vision. Despite the pressures that came with his newfound visibility, David remained focused on his mission. He knew that the real work wasn't about building his brand or gaining recognition, it was about creating a lasting impact. He continued to speak out, to mentor, and to challenge the status quo. David's story was no longer just about the X900 or the dealership that had once rejected him. It was about creating a world where everyone, regardless of their background, could succeed. The success of his scholarship program led to the creation of other initiatives aimed at supporting marginalized communities. David helped establish internships, training programs, and networking events that allowed people from all walks of life to connect with industry leaders and gain valuable experience. The ripple effect of his work began to spread, reaching communities that had once been excluded from opportunities in high-paying fields. He had become not just a mentor, but a force for change, a man who had used his success to empower others. As David looked back on his journey, he realized that everything he had done, the auction, the scholarships, the speaking engagements, had been part of a larger, more profound mission. It wasn't about the car or the money. It was about rewriting the narrative of what success looked like. For David, success was not defined by the possessions you owned or the accolades you received. Success was about lifting others up, about ensuring that everyone had the chance to reach their full potential, no matter where they came from. David's story had come full circle, but the journey was far from over. Every day, he was reminded of why he had started this path in the first place, to make a difference. He wasn't just going to be remembered as the man who bought an expensive car and used it to raise money for scholarships. He would be remembered as the man who refused to let the world define him, the man who used his platform to change lives and inspire a new generation of leaders. And in the end, that was what mattered most, the legacy he left behind. The X900 had been his starting point, but the true reward was in the lives he had touched, the barriers he had broken, and the future he had helped to build. David's story wasn't just about overcoming one rejection at a dealership, it was about challenging the very idea of what it meant to succeed and proving that anyone, regardless of their background, could rise to the top and make a lasting difference. David's journey had taken him from a man who had once been rejected at a luxury car dealership to a force for social change. As he looked back on his story, he realized that the road had been far more complicated than he had ever imagined, but every twist and turn had been necessary for his transformation. It was no longer about the rejection he had faced that day or the car he had fought so hard to own. It was about the people whose lives he had touched, the systems he had challenged, and the future he had helped shape. But as David continued to rise, he knew that his work was far from finished. He had made a name for himself, built a platform, and used his influence to bring about real change, but the world wasn't ready for him to rest. There was still so much more to do. He had proven to himself and the world that one person could make a difference, but the work to reshape societal structures, to fight inequality and injustice, was ongoing. The fight wasn't just about a car dealership, it was about dismantling the deep-rooted prejudices that held people back based on race, wealth, or background. It was about ensuring that success wasn't limited to the privileged few but accessible to everyone, no matter their starting point in life. One of the projects that David became particularly passionate about in the following years was creating a platform to amplify the voices of those who had been marginalized in the corporate world. There were too many talented individuals who never got the chance to prove themselves simply because they didn't fit the mold that industries had come to expect. David saw this every day. He had met so many young people through his scholarship program who had potential but lacked the connections, opportunities, and resources that could open doors for them. He understood how deeply this hurt not just the individuals affected, but the industries that were missing out on so much untapped talent. It wasn't enough for him to just provide financial aid, David wanted to ensure that these young people had the platforms to succeed. To achieve this, David founded an organization called Rise Above, a network designed to connect underrepresented groups with industry professionals, to create mentorship opportunities, and to guide them in the direction of financial independence and success. He brought together executives from top companies, successful entrepreneurs, and influential thought leaders who shared his commitment to diversity and inclusion. The goal of Rise Above was to provide the resources and the connections needed to bridge the gap between untapped talent and the opportunities that had been traditionally reserved for the privileged. It wasn't just about funding or internships, it was about giving people the tools they needed to take control of their futures. As the platform grew, David began to see the tangible effects of his efforts. He received messages from people who had once thought their dreams were unattainable, telling him how Rise Above had opened doors they never thought were possible. A young woman named Tasha, who had struggled to find her place in the tech industry, reached out to David to thank him. She had been working as a receptionist at a small company, dreaming of one day becoming a software engineer. She had always been told that women, especially women of color, were unlikely to succeed in that field. But after joining the Rise Above network, Tasha was paired with a mentor who helped her transition into a junior software engineering position at a leading tech firm. Now, she was leading projects of her own and mentoring others who were in the same position she had once been in. Tasha's story wasn't an isolated one. As more young people were connected with mentors, internships, and jobs, David's sense of fulfillment deepened. The joy of knowing that his actions were creating lasting change was something he couldn't put into words. The world he had worked so hard to change was starting to open up for those who had been previously overlooked, and it was all thanks to the platform he had created. However, this success didn't come without its challenges. Not everyone was on board with the movement David was leading. There were those who viewed his efforts as a threat to the status quo, people who felt uncomfortable with the idea that the playing field should be leveled. Some of his business partners, especially those who had benefited from the existing system, began to express doubts about the direction Rise Above was heading. They feared that the changes David was championing could disrupt the industries that had always been their bread and butter. The criticisms ranged from claims that Rise Above was reverse discrimination to accusations that David's work was an attempt to fix something that wasn't broken. These comments stung. David had worked tirelessly to create a program that empowered those who had been overlooked, to give them the chance they deserved to succeed. But instead of being met with the support he expected, he found himself in the crosshairs of a deeply entrenched system that wasn't ready for change. At first, the weight of these attacks felt heavy. He had sacrificed so much for this cause, his time, his energy, and his own comfort, and yet he was being questioned by those who saw his efforts as a threat to their dominance. But David, having come so far, was not one to back down. He knew that change would never come without opposition, and the very fact that people were resisting meant that he was on the right path. He couldn't let the criticisms of a few deter him from the bigger picture. David's resolve only grew stronger. He doubled down on his mission, speaking out more forcefully about the need for inclusivity in business and pushing for more opportunities for those who had historically been denied a seat at the table. Through it all, David remained committed to his cause. He never lost sight of the young people whose lives had been transformed by the opportunities he had fought to provide. The lives of people like Marcus, Tasha, and countless others were a testament to the power of perseverance and vision. For them, David had made it possible to believe that anything was within reach. And for David, that was enough. In time, the resistance began to fade. More and more businesses began to see the value in diversity and inclusion. They recognized that by providing opportunities to people from all walks of life, they weren't just doing the right thing, they were also building stronger, more innovative organizations. Slowly, the corporate world began to shift, and Rise Above became a symbol of what was possible when individuals refused to accept the limits placed on them by society. David's legacy was no longer just about the car dealership or the X900. It wasn't even just about the scholarships or the Rise Above network. His legacy was a movement, one that would continue to inspire future generations to fight for equality and to ensure that success was not determined by where you came from, but by what you could contribute to the world. His story had proven that even in the face of adversity, one person could change the course of history. Years later, David sat in a meeting room filled with young entrepreneurs and business leaders, many of whom had come up through the ranks of the programs he had started. As he looked around the room, he saw the faces of people who had once been told they didn't belong, people who were now thriving in industries that had once been closed off to them. His heart swelled with pride. This was the real success, the change he had fought for, the lives he had touched, and the world that was slowly but surely becoming a place where opportunity was available to everyone. David had once been a man on the outside looking in. Now, he had helped create a world where anyone, regardless of their background, had a chance to rise above.